Westminster Abbey, June 2, 1953. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II has already lasted more than 3 hours. Outside, 1 million people line the processional route despite the rain. Inside, 2,000 guests pack the Abbey's carved wooden pews, their breath warm in the cold stone air. The ceremony has been televised, the first British coronation to be broadcast, and across the country, 27 million people are watching on screens they borrowed or crowded around in neighbors' sitting rooms, in pub windows, in department store displays. In a reception that follows, as the formal weight of the ceremony eases into something approaching a social occasion, a tabloid reporter covering the event notices something he has never seen from a royal. Princess Margaret, the new queen's younger sister, reaches up and brushes a piece of lint from the uniform jacket of Group Captain Peter Townsend. One gesture. The Chips Channon Diaries would later record the social shockwave it caused. Within 2 weeks, a Sunday newspaper had described the act as implying an unusual intimacy, and the story was on the front pages of newspapers across 3 continents. What that reporter caught wasn't just an intimate moment between 2 people. It was the beginning of a collision between 2 sisters, one iron rule, and a church whose very reason for existing contradicted the thing it was now demanding. The Church of England was created, in the most literal institutional sense, so that a king could end his marriage. In 1955, its doctrinal authority would be deployed to stop a princess from beginning one. And the woman responsible for upholding that authority was the princess's own sister, who had sworn at her coronation to maintain it inviolably. If you've been watching the British royal family over the last decade, you already recognize something instinctive in this pattern. One sibling built for duty, one who refused to be told no. William and Harry have made the dynamic familiar again. But the first version of that story, the one with genuine historical weight behind it, was Elizabeth and Margaret. And unlike the modern version, theirs ended with a wound that neither sister chose, and a bond that somehow survived it anyway. Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born at 2:40 in the morning on April 21, 1926, at 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair, London. Not in a palace, but in her maternal grandparents' private home. Her father, Prince Albert, was the Duke of York, the second son of King George V. Her mother was Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. At the moment of Elizabeth's birth, 2 people stood between her and the throne: her uncle Edward, the Prince of Wales, and her own father. The general expectation, widely held in court and public alike, was that Edward would eventually marry and produce heirs. Nobody planned for Elizabeth to become queen. 4 years and 4 months later, on August 21, 1930, Margaret Rose arrived at Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, her mother's ancestral home, a 15th-century tower house remodeled over centuries by the Bowes Lyon family. Margaret was the first royal baby born in Scotland for more than 300 years. The Home Secretary, J.R. Clines, was present at the birth to verify it, per the custom of the time. Registration of the birth was delayed for several days to avoid recording her as number 13 in the parish register. The family was now 4: the Duke and Duchess of York, Elizabeth, and Margaret. They called themselves We 4, and their life, by all available accounts, was genuinely warm. A domestic sphere built around dogs and horses, and the relatively private rhythms of a family that nobody was watching closely enough to worry about. They lived at 145 Piccadilly in London, a tall white stuccoed townhouse just east of Hyde Park Corner, and at Royal Lodge in Windsor's Great Park. The public found them charming. The press described them as an ideal domestic unit, and the 2 little girls grew up with no particular destiny beyond marrying well and supporting the crown from a comfortable subsidiary distance. George VI, then still just the Duke of York, was said by biographers to have described his daughters with a distinction that appears across memoirs and retrospectives, though no single primary document has been identified as its origin. Elizabeth was his pride. Margaret was his joy. That asymmetry, however lightly meant, captures something real about both of them from the beginning. Elizabeth organized her toys with methodical care and kept her rooms tidy. Marion Crawford, the Scottish governess who supervised both princesses, wrote in her 1950 memoir, The Little Princesses, of Elizabeth's love of horses and dogs, her orderliness, and her attitude of responsibility. Winston Churchill, encountering Elizabeth when she was 2 years old, reportedly described her as a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. Her cousin Margaret Rhodes called her a jolly little girl, but fundamentally sensible and well-behaved. Margaret was different in almost every visible way. Crawford wrote of her light-hearted fun and frolics, and her amusing and outrageous antics. Her contemporaries thought she was spoiled by her father, who allowed her liberties not usually permitted to children. Staying up to dinner at 13, never corrected in the way other royal children were. She was vivacious, mischievous, and absolutely certain of her own appeal. Crawford would later despair to friends, "Could you this year only ask Princess Elizabeth to your party? Princess Margaret does draw all the attention." Elizabeth's response, when she heard this, was characteristic. "Oh, it's so much easier when Margaret's there. Everybody laughs at what Margaret says." There was no resentment in that. There was love and a clear-eyed acknowledgement of difference that would define their relationship for the next half-century. What upended all of it arrived in December 1936. The instrument of abdication was signed at Fort Belvedere on December 10th, witnessed by Edward's 3 brothers, including Prince Albert, Duke of York. The legal effect came the following day, December 11th, when Parliament enacted His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act. That evening, King Edward VIII broadcast his farewell over the BBC. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." The woman was Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose second divorce was still being finalized. The Church of England, whose supreme governor the monarch was constitutionally required to be, formally held that no divorced person could remarry while a living former spouse existed. The governments of the United Kingdom and the Dominions had made clear they wouldn't accept her as queen consort. Edward left. Prince Albert, the man who, by every account, never wanted the throne and was physically sick with anxiety at the prospect of it, became King George VI. His elder daughter, 10 years old, automatically became heir presumptive. Not heir apparent. Under the rules of male preference primogeniture then in force, a hypothetical younger brother could still have displaced her. But in practical terms, Elizabeth was now destined for the throne. Margaret, 6, was second in line to a position she had never been expected to hold. Marion Crawford recorded a fragment of the moment when it became real to the children. Margaret, puzzled by the gossip swirling through the household about their uncle and a woman she didn't know, asked her elder sister what it all meant. Elizabeth tried to explain. Crawford's account captures the texture of those conversations. The older girl doing her best to translate a constitutional crisis into something a 6-year-old could understand. Neither of them fully grasping yet what it would cost them. The family moved from their private townhouse at 145 Piccadilly into Buckingham Palace. The domestic warmth of "we four" didn't disappear. George VI was determined it wouldn't, but the context around it changed irrevocably. The public scrutiny that had been occasional and manageable became permanent and institutional. And the 2 girls who had expected a life of comfortable secondary royalty found themselves in very different positions in the architecture of the British state. The divergence in their preparation began almost immediately. From 1938 onward, Henry Martin, vice provost of Eton College, a distinguished constitutional historian, traveled to the palace to instruct Princess Elizabeth in the mechanics of constitutional history and the workings of British government. The arrangement was created specifically because she was heir presumptive. It had no equivalent for Margaret. Martin was, by accounts, an eccentric figure. He fed nuts to a pet squirrel during tutorials, but he was also the man who would introduce Elizabeth to the structures that would govern her working life. He set papers. He marked them. Elizabeth was shy with him at first, formal in the way 12-year-olds can be with adults they find intimidating. But she absorbed what he gave her with the same methodical reliability she brought to everything. Elizabeth received additional instruction in religion from the Archbishop of Canterbury and in French from the Vicomtesse de Bellaigue. She was gradually introduced to state papers and the dispatch boxes that would consume her working life for 70 years. By 1943, she was undertaking solo public appearances. In 1945, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service as a driver and mechanic, number 230873, the first senior royal woman to serve in the armed forces. Margaret received none of this. Her education continued largely as before: the shared governess, French lessons, music, the social accomplishments considered appropriate for a young royal lady. No constitutional tutoring, no preparation for institutional duty, no equivalent to the Martin sessions that were quietly shaping her sister. When Elizabeth joined the ATS in 1945, Margaret was famously jealous. "I was born too late," she was reported to have said, too young to serve herself. What went unspoken was that even if she had been old enough, the shape of her preparation had not been pointed toward that kind of public function. The gap was structural, not personal. Neither parent was the villain of this arrangement. The Duchess of York, who supervised both daughters' education, had her own views. Biographers note she told a friend she regretted that her daughters didn't go to school like other children, though the decision may have been made at George V's insistence. Margaret herself, in later life, expressed resentment about the educational gap and directed the criticism at her mother. It was, sources note, always a bone of contention. But the deeper truth was that one daughter needed to absorb the machinery of monarchy, and one didn't. The institution made that determination, and Margaret grew up without a role it ever clearly defined. What she had instead was vivacity, beauty, wit, and an increasingly magnetic social presence. By her late teens and early 20s, she was the center of what the press called the Margaret set. Young aristocrats and celebrities who gathered around her at the 400 Club and the Café de Paris and the Mirabelle restaurant. She performed the can-can at a fancy dress ball at the American ambassador's residence in July 1949. She met Danny Kaye at the London Palladium and invited him into the royal social circle. She was, by all contemporary accounts, a dazzling socialite, the kind of person who filled whatever room she entered and left an after-image in it when she walked out. She knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. What she didn't have was a framework for what she was supposed to do with any of it. One detail from the years before the abdication belongs here, though it must be placed on the correct monarch. On January 20th, 1936, King George V died at Sandringham. The official cause: bronchitis complicated by heart disease. But Lord Dawson of Penn, the physician to the royal family, later president of the Royal College of Physicians, wrote in his private diary that he had personally decided to determine the end. According to his own account, recorded in a diary that his widow showed to historian Francis Watson in 1950, and which Watson disclosed publicly in History Today in 1986, Dawson injected 3/4 of a grain of morphine and 1 grain of cocaine into the king's distended jugular vein to hasten his death. One of his documented reasons: ensuring the announcement could be made in the morning newspapers, specifically the Times, rather than the evening press. The British Medical Journal later characterized Dawson's actions as a convenience killing. The detail belongs here not as sensation but as context. This was a world in which the management of appearances was treated as an institutional obligation, serious enough to shape even the manner of a king's dying. The king who mattered most to Elizabeth and Margaret died very differently. George VI had been declining for years. He was a heavy smoker who developed lung cancer, though the diagnosis was withheld from him, the public, and most of the medical profession. His left lung was removed in September 1951, described publicly as treatment for structural abnormalities. He waved Elizabeth and Philip off at London Airport on January 31, 1952, his last public appearance, a thin figure in the January cold, standing on the tarmac until the plane disappeared. On the night of February 5th into the morning of February 6th, he died in his sleep at Sandringham House, found by his valet around 7:30 a.m. He was 56. The cause was coronary thrombosis, on a background of lung cancer and cardiovascular disease. He simply didn't wake up. The night before he died, he had gone out shooting on the estate and returned in good spirits. Elizabeth was in Kenya. She and Philip had spent the night at the Treetops Hotel in the Aberdare region, a game viewing lodge built on stilts above a watering hole, where guests could watch elephants and buffalo come to drink in the African dark. They had sat through the night watching. By the time the news arrived, they had moved to nearby Sagana Lodge. Philip told her. She was 25 years old and was now the queen. The image that stays from the accounts of that afternoon, Elizabeth walking alone in the garden of Sagana Lodge, composing herself before she had to face anyone, writing down a list of things that would need to be done, isn't the image of a woman overwhelmed. It's the image of someone doing what they had been trained to do, engaging the machinery at the exact moment it was needed, because the alternative wasn't available to her. Margaret, back in London, was described across multiple accounts as devastated. She required sedatives to sleep. She had written of her father, "He was such a wonderful person, the very heart and center of our happy family." And she attended church, in the weeks after, sometimes twice in a single day, consoled, biographers note, by a Christian faith that was genuine and deeply held, not performative. George VI had been Margaret's closest ally within the family structure, the parent most willing to indulge her, whose approval she sought, whose presence made her relative freedom within the institution feel sanctioned. His death removed that protection at the exact moment Elizabeth gained the full weight of the crown. 2 women, 1 morning in February. For Elizabeth, February 6, 1952 was the beginning of 70 years of constitutional responsibility. For Margaret, it was the day she lost the one person who could say yes to her without asking what the institution required first. Group Captain Peter Townsend wasn't a disreputable figure. He wasn't a commoner with no standing. He was a decorated Battle of Britain ace who helped shoot down the first German bomber to crash on British soil in 1940. After that engagement, Townsend visited survivors in hospital. He took them cigarettes. "I thought," Townsend later explained, "this may happen to any of us, so I went to see him just to say, well, we're not really enemies after all. We're human beings." That instinct, the impulse toward decency, even in the middle of violence, runs through every account of the man. He flew Hurricanes throughout the Battle of Britain as commanding officer of No. 85 Squadron, was shot down and wounded on August 31, 1940, losing his big toe to a cannon shell that passed through his cockpit, and returned to operational flying within 3 weeks. His wartime record: 9 aircraft destroyed, 2 shared, 2 probable, 4 damaged. His full decorations: Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar, Distinguished Service Order, Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. Group Captain Peter Townsend, CVO, DSO, DFC, and BAR, was the record of a man who had spent the war doing something genuinely dangerous and doing it exceptionally. In 1944, appointed heir equerry to King George VI, he traded the cockpit for the palace. The king valued his quiet efficiency. He was calm, capable, and discreet. He moved with the royal household, lived within the Windsor estate, and became part of the fabric of the family's daily life in the way that a trusted staff member, who is also a genuine personality, sometimes does. Seen at meals, present at private moments, someone the children addressed without formality because formality felt wrong for him. He first met Margaret properly during the 3-month royal tour of southern Africa in early 1947. His official role was to look after the princesses. Southern Africa in the southern hemisphere summer, the air hot and dry off the veldt, red dust, the sound of horses in the early morning when the heat was still bearable. They rode together before breakfast on many of those mornings, Margaret, 16, and Townsend, 32, on horses lent by locals near the royal train. "We rode together every morning in that wonderful country, in marvelous weather," Margaret reportedly told friends years later. "That's when I really fell in love with him." She was 16. He was married with 2 children. Whatever he felt at the time, he kept it to himself. What mutual witnesses observed was chemistry, the kind that operates below the threshold of acknowledged feeling, that makes the air between 2 people different from the air around anyone else in the room. Margaret's biographer Craig Brown recorded that, according to a National Trust curator, Townsend requested a bedroom next to hers during a later visit to Belfast in October 1947. The detail is small. The implication isn't. Townsend placed the beginning of his own acknowledged love at Balmoral in August 1951, during a picnic where he recalled Margaret waking him from a nap while the king watched from a comfortable distance. Lady Jane Rain, a friend of Margaret's, told the BBC's Time Watch program in 2005 that she had witnessed them at a shooting party in Balmoral that same year, around Margaret's 21st birthday in August. "Like the proverbial gooseberry, I felt I shouldn't have been there," Rain said. "They never kissed or held hands or anything, but you could just feel it." In 1952, Townsend's first wife, Rosemary Paul, divorced him. Her infidelity cited as the cause, making him the innocent party in the legal terminology of the time. The divorce was finalized in December 1952. Townsend then proposed to Margaret. Within the royal household, this was known. The question of what to do about it wasn't. At the coronation on June 2, 1953, back in Westminster Abbey, in the aftermath of a ceremony that had lasted the better part of the day, the reporter's observation crystallized what the household already knew. Time magazine described the romance as the most controversial royal relationship since that of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. The comparison was legally precise as well as dramatic. Because Townsend was divorced and his former wife was still living, and that single fact, not his rank, not his age, not the 16-year gap between them, was the immovable obstacle. 3 separate mechanisms worked together to make this marriage nearly impossible. The first was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed by George III after his brothers made unsuitable marriages. Under the act, all descendants of King George II required the sovereign's consent, signified under the Great Seal, declared in council, before marrying. Any marriage contracted without that consent was null and void. Margaret was 22 at the time of the coronation. She needed her sister's permission. There was a statutory escape route available to those over 25. Give 12 months' written notice to the Privy Council, and if neither House of Parliament formally disapproved during that period, the marriage could proceed without sovereign consent. But parliamentary disapproval wasn't merely theoretical in a climate of political opposition, and 12 months was a long time. The second mechanism was constitutional convention, the principle that the monarch acts on ministerial advice for matters with political implications. In 1953, the government was Winston Churchill's. His cabinet, haunted by the memory of the 1936 abdication and its cost to the institution, was firmly opposed. Alan Lascelles, the Queen's powerful private secretary, a man whose service stretched back to the abdication crisis, reportedly told Townsend directly that he must be mad or bad if he thought he could marry the sister of the Church of England's head. Townsend was sent to Brussels as heir attaché, framed publicly as a posting, experienced by both parties as something considerably closer to exile. He lived in a hotel room, alone, for 2 years. They wrote to each other almost every day. The third mechanism, and in doctrinal terms the most absolute, was the Church of England itself. The Church of England came into its distinctive institutional form through the Act of Supremacy of 1534. Henry VIII, unable to persuade the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, had arranged through Parliament for himself to be declared supreme head of the Church in England, abolishing papal jurisdiction and placing the English Church under the Crown. The word annulment matters here. Henry sought a declaration that no valid marriage had ever existed, a theological argument resting on Leviticus chapter 20 verse 21, and the claim that Catherine, as his brother Arthur's former wife, was forbidden to him by divine law. Rome rejected this reading, refused to recognize the English proceedings, and eventually excommunicated Henry. But within England, the effect was irreversible. A church now existed whose distinct institutional form was built on the premise that an English crown's marital situation wasn't subject to external ecclesiastical authority. By the mid-20th century, this same institution was Elizabeth II's constitutional inheritance. At her 1953 coronation, she swore to maintain and preserve inviolably the settlement of the Church of England and the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government thereof, as by law established. She held the title Supreme Governor, modified from Henry's Supreme Head under Elizabeth I in 1559 to avoid any suggestion of a claim to divinity, but functionally continuous since. The Church of England, in the 1950s, maintained a formal prohibition of absolute simplicity. It wouldn't use its marriage service for any person with a living former spouse. Not because that person had caused the divorce. Not for any mitigating factor. The Church's 1935 convocation had already reaffirmed that, in no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband. Geoffrey Fisher, the Archbishop of Canterbury, maintained this position publicly and without qualification throughout the Townsend years. Townsend's divorce had been granted on the grounds of his wife's infidelity. He was, in law, the innocent party. None of that mattered. His former wife was alive. A Church of England wedding was impossible, doctrinally and absolutely. The irony needs no amplification. An institution whose consolidated form arose from a royal determination to override Rome's authority over marital decisions, specifically to escape judgment on whether an existing royal marriage was valid, had become the primary doctrinal obstacle to a royal woman beginning a marriage of her own. The church Henry built to serve a king's refusal to be bound by marriage doctrine now cited marriage doctrine to bind a princess. There is a technical distinction worth preserving. Henry sought an annulment, not what we would today call a divorce. His argument was that his marriage to Catherine had never been canonically valid in the first place. This is a genuinely different theological category from dissolving a recognized marriage. But the operational reality of what the Church of England did, in both cases, was use its authority over the definition of valid Christian marriage to determine what a royal could and couldn't do with their personal life. Different mechanism, same institution, same result. The Church formally changed its position on remarriage after divorce only in 2002, the same year Margaret died. Here is where the popular version of this story tends to go wrong. The dominant image, reinforced by dramatizations, repeated in newspapers, embedded in public memory, is of Elizabeth as the cold, institutional enforcer who froze her sister out of love and loyalty both, choosing the monarchy over her own blood. The archival record, when it became available, was more complicated and considerably more interesting. While Margaret was under 25 in 1953, Elizabeth was legally required under the Royal Marriages Act to provide consent and constitutionally expected to follow the advice of Churchill's government. She didn't manufacture the opposition, she inherited it. The Church's position was fixed, the cabinet's was fixed. The political climate was shaped by the memory of an abdication that had cost the institution enormously, and which nobody with any institutional memory wanted to approach again. Elizabeth's private secretary, Martin Charteris, said later that the Queen was naturally sympathetic towards the princess, but hoped, given time, the affair would resolve itself. That sympathy is consistent with what archival documents subsequently revealed. Documents released from the National Archives in 2004, covering events from 1955, showed that Elizabeth and Prime Minister Anthony Eden had worked together on a detailed compromise proposal. The Queen and Eden co-developed a plan under which Margaret could marry Townsend and keep both her royal title and her civil list income. The £6,000 a year she already received, plus the additional £9,000, to which she would become entitled on marriage under the Civil List Act of 1952. The only conditions were that she would renounce her succession rights and those of her children, and that the wedding would take place in a register office, not a Church of England ceremony. Eden, himself divorced and remarried, was described in contemporary documents as sympathetic to the couple's situation. His formulation to Commonwealth prime ministers read, "Her Majesty wouldn't wish to stand in the way of her sister's happiness." The plan was drafted in 3 versions. The Commonwealth governments had been quietly squared in advance. Lord Kilmuir, the Lord Chancellor, told Eden in a September 1955 letter that the Royal Marriages Act itself was badly drawn and uncertain and embarrassing in its effect, and doubted whether it even legally applied to Margaret at all, given an obscure exemption for descendants of princesses who had married into foreign families. The Guardian, reporting on the released documents in 2004, concluded, "The offer blows apart the belief at the time and maintained in the obituaries 2 years ago that their marriage would have left her frozen out of the royal family and dependent on Townsend's RAF pay." What the plan couldn't provide was a Church of England marriage service. That was genuine ecclesiastical veto. The church building and the marriage rite were unavailable, on doctrinal grounds that were fixed and not subject to Eden's political arithmetic. But the civil route was real. The financial and title protections were real. What stopped it, as far as the records reveal, was Margaret herself. Townsend returned from Brussels in October 1955. He had been given the use of a flat in London, borrowed from a friend, and the world's press descended on it immediately. In his 1978 BBC interview, he described what those 19 days felt like from inside. Besieged, hemmed in, the flat circled by 50 to 100 journalists from publications in every capital on earth, working in the kind of pressure that turns private decisions into public spectacles and makes it almost impossible to hear your own thoughts clearly. The couple met. They talked. They were trying to reach a decision that would determine the rest of their lives, while the entire world sat outside the door waiting to report on it. Margaret visited Archbishop Fisher at Lambeth Palace at her own request on October 27th, seeking guidance. Fisher wasn't, in any version of events, a sympathetic figure to her situation. He had publicly maintained his position on remarriage throughout. What he said to her in that private meeting isn't documented. What is documented is that he afterward described her as a thoroughly good Christian churchwoman. On October 31st, 1955, BBC newsreader John Snagg interrupted normal programming to read a brief statement from Clarence House. The statement, as broadcast, was this: I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so I have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend. 5 things emerge from that text. First, Margaret explicitly acknowledges a civil marriage was materially possible. The Eden Plan was real, and she knew it. Second, she invokes church teaching as her own reasoning, not as an external prohibition imposed on her. Third, she cites duty to the Commonwealth. Fourth, she says she reached the decision entirely alone. Fifth, the statement contains no indication of coercion, no suggestion she was acting under duress, rather than by her own conviction. A letter Margaret had written to Eden in August 1955 had already signaled something. She said she would see Townsend in October and added, "It's only by seeing him in this way that I feel I can properly decide whether I can marry him or not." Former BBC royal correspondent Paul Reynolds, writing in 2016 after analysis of the National Archives documents, noted that the letter could suggest that Margaret's determination to marry him wasn't quite as strong as has been believed. 2 years of separation had passed. The Margaret who returned to London in October 1955 wasn't the same woman who had watched Townsend drive away to Brussels in 1953. She had relaunched herself socially. She had demonstrated, to herself and to the world, that she could hold a room without him. Whatever she felt when she saw him again, and neither of them documented it with any precision, it appears she was genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty may have been the answer. Townsend would say in his 1978 BBC interview that he believed she had made the right decision, that he was hardly enough to compensate for these very serious, admittedly material losses. He said, "She would have been stripped of practically everything." Except that wasn't accurate by 1955. The Guardian documents showed she wouldn't have been. Title, income, public role, country of residence, all preserved under the Eden Plan. The stripped of everything framing that Townsend apparently believed was the earlier 1953 version of the situation, before Eden's compromise was constructed. By October 1955, the material terms were far less punitive than popular memory recorded, which means whatever Margaret's final decision involved, her genuine faith, her sense of duty, her ambivalence about what 2 years of separation had done to the feeling, her private calculation of what she was and wasn't willing to trade. It was more complicated than coercion, and more honest than performance. Nobody can answer the "what if" question honestly, but the record does say certain things. Townsend was, by every account of those who knew him, a man of genuine character and genuine affection. He wasn't a reckless figure or a manipulative one. He was, if anything, reticent, self-aware, and emotionally careful. His feeling for Margaret was documented and sincere. The Eden Plan would have left her with her title, her income, her country, and her public duties. The financial sacrifice that popular narrative assumed, the image of Mrs. Townsend living somewhere modest on an Air Force officer's pay, wasn't what she was actually being offered by October 1955. She was offered something much closer to the life she already had. Against that, the age difference of nearly 16 years, Townsend's 2 sons from his first marriage, who would be part of any new family. The question of whether 2 years apart had genuinely cooled something that had been real, or whether the relentless pressure of the decision had made ambivalence feel like certainty. And there is this. which the record states plainly. The marriage Margaret did choose freely to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones on May 6, 1960. The first royal wedding televised in Britain, in Westminster Abbey, watched by millions, also ended in divorce. The Snowdon marriage separated in 1976 and was formally dissolved on July 11, 1978. Described in contemporary accounts as the first divorce in the immediate royal family since Henry VIII. The same irony, recycled by the same family one generation later. Would marrying Peter Townsend have made Margaret happier? The record supports no confident answer. Townsend himself married Marie-Luce Germania, a Belgian woman, in 1959. She was 20 years old to his 45, and by accounts, led a quiet, contented life in France, writing books about the Battle of Britain and the royal family he had served. His memoir, Time and Chance, published in 1978, mentioned Margaret with characteristic restraint. He died of stomach cancer on June 19, 1995, in Saint-Léger-en-Yvelines, France, aged 80. A sculpture of him stands today in Townsend Square, part of the Kings Hill development on the former site of RAF West Malling, the airfield from which he had commanded operations during the war. Their final meeting was in 1992 at Kensington Palace, lunch and a walk together in the garden, nearly 40 years after the coronation. Neither spoke publicly about what passed between them that afternoon. Asked in the 1978 BBC interview how he would feel if Margaret walked in, Townsend said, "I should be delighted to see her, and I presume that if she walked into this room, it would only be because she would be delighted to see me." What Margaret built after 1955 wasn't a diminished life. She was, for 2 decades, one of the most vivid public figures in Britain, her glamour intact, her wit celebrated, her social circle spanning the arts, theater, and the cultural ferment of the 1960s. She accumulated extensive charitable commitments and served as president of Girl Guiding UK from 1965 until her death. She was also, by the later decades, a woman who paid for the way she had lived. Heavy smoking throughout her adult life, a social world that consumed itself in excess, health that eventually couldn't sustain it. She had part of her lung removed in 1985. From 1998, she suffered a series of strokes. On February 9, 2002, she died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, following a final stroke and cardiac complications. She was 71. She was cremated, a break with royal tradition, reflecting her own long-standing wish. Her ashes were interred on April 9, 2002, in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle, alongside her parents. Her sister would eventually join them in the same chapel. Queen Elizabeth II visited Kensington Palace on February 11, 2002, 2 days after Margaret's death, to see her sister's body. Margaret's funeral took place on February 15 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same chapel where Elizabeth's own committal service would eventually be held decades later. It was the 50th anniversary, almost to the day, of their father's death. The 2 funerals, Margaret's and Elizabeth's, were held 20 years apart in the same stone building, and the women who occupied opposite sides of the same throne now rest feet from each other in its memorial chapel. Andrew Morton, who spent years studying both women, wrote that Princess Margaret understood the Queen in a way no one else could. The understanding was rooted in something no biographer could fully reconstruct from outside: a shared childhood at 145 Piccadilly and Royal Lodge and Sandringham, a shared experience of watching the abdication reshape their father at ages 10 and 6, a shared loss of the man they both adored, a shared position inside a world that very few human beings have ever inhabited from birth. The Crawford memoir recorded Elizabeth's remark about her sister with characteristic precision. Oh, it's so much easier when Margaret's there. Everybody laughs at what Margaret says. There was no resentment in that. There was love, and a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what Margaret was and what Elizabeth, by the nature of her position, could never quite be. Elizabeth was the one people respected. Margaret was the one they remembered the instant she left the room. What the Townsend episode cost both of them can't be reconstructed from archives in any emotionally precise way. The private correspondence between them doesn't exist in the public record. The conversations, if they happened in the form biographers imagine, left no documentary trail. What is preserved is the structure. Elizabeth held the crown, and holding it meant operating within constraints she had sworn to maintain at her coronation. She was legally required to provide consent or withhold it. She was constitutionally expected to follow ministerial advice. She was supreme governor of the institution whose doctrine blocked a church wedding. She was the system's keeper, not its architect. And she appears to have worked, actively, to find a path that would have permitted her sister's happiness, a path that the records confirm was constructed and offered, and that Margaret chose not to take. They went on. They continued to spend holidays together. They continued the private language of sisters who had grown up as each other's nearest witness and remained so through everything the institution demanded of both of them. One source from the later years describes Margaret whispering something to her elder sister at a formal occasion, an aside, a quick remark, the kind of communication that passes between two people who share 60 years of shared reference and don't need to explain themselves. What she said isn't recorded. That it happened is. England, 1534. A king tears a church away from Rome because the Pope won't let him end his marriage. He names himself its supreme head. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would later revise that title to Supreme Governor. 4 centuries later, Elizabeth II would inherit it, swear at her coronation to maintain the church's settlement inviolably, and then watch as that settlement's doctrine made a civil marriage the only option her sister had, and the church's institutional weight made even the political cost of that civil marriage feel, for years, prohibitive. The paradox wasn't subtle. Henry created an institution by asserting that no external religious authority could bind an English crown on the question of marriage. That same institution's doctrinal authority was then used, 4 centuries later, to apply exactly that kind of binding pressure to a royal who wanted to choose her own spouse. Margaret didn't say the church was wrong to hold its position. Her 1955 statement invoked that position as her own reasoning. She was, by Archbishop Fisher's testimony, a sincere Christian who took the church's teaching seriously. The difficulty, if it's one, is that she appears to have genuinely internalized the contradiction, carrying it not as oppression but as conviction. And Elizabeth, who held the supreme governorship, who swore the coronation oath, who was constitutionally bound to follow ministerial advice on matters with this level of institutional significance, Elizabeth wasn't the architect of the barrier. She was its keeper, not by preference, but by the logic of everything she had become since December 1936. One accident of birth made her a queen. That same accident placed her sister in a position where the one thing she genuinely wanted required her sister's permission, and where the institution her sister now embodied made that permission, in its fullest and most meaningful form, impossible to give. The 2 women who left Buckingham Palace on May 8, 1945, incognito, dancing the conga through the VE Day crowds, chanting, "We want the King! We want the Queen!" with the rest of London, swept along, as Elizabeth would later recall, on a tide of happiness and relief, ended up on opposite sides of a desk that neither of them designed. They didn't choose this. They inherited it, as they had inherited everything else. Margaret died in February 2002. Her ashes rested with her father's in a chapel she had known since childhood. Elizabeth died in September 2022. She was interred in the same chapel, with the same parents, with the same sister. The rule that divided them made no rational sense. An institution born from the desire to escape Rome's judgment on a royal marriage turned around and used that desire's legacy to constrain a royal woman's choice. The church Henry built to serve a king's refusal to be bound by marriage doctrine became the doctrinal instrument that bound a princess. And the crown gave Elizabeth authority over everything, including the power to act as the institutional weight pressing on the one person she had grown up beside. Of everything the institution gave and took, the crowns, the constraints, the public oath, and the private cost, it never finally managed to sever this. Two sisters, shaped by the same accident, divided by the same oath, rest now in the same small chapel at Windsor, with the father who called one his pride and the other his joy. Subscribe for more stories like this.